Welcome to the Rangers Roost. My name is Tennyson E. Stead. I'm the creator of Jump Rangers, as well as a working screenwriter. And this is our weekly chat in AMA, where we sit down and talk about narrative design and game design and screenwriting and Hollywood and geek culture and whatever else strikes our fancy. Today, uh, as I posted in social media, we're going to be talking about the craft of world building just a little bit. Um, and the question I kind of posed in my social media streams is when you're building a world, a whole fictional world from scratch, where do you start? And, you know, to a very large degree, that's going to depend on what media you're actually working in. If you're working in film or television, then the place to start is with the actions of the characters, and you build the world around what you need for those actions. What are the characters trying to achieve in the story that you're telling? And how can you build a world that's going to make that story more interesting, right? That's the place to start. If you're building a game, you're building the narrative around what the players are actually doing and what's going to empower that play. If you're writing a novel, inevitably, you're building a world around theme and what the different elements of that world kind of suggest about our world. That's where literature starts, right? But there's a couple of, I think, common threads when it comes to world building and transmedia. If you're building something that you expect to live beyond specifically the story that you're telling, then I think that there's a couple of really important guidelines, at least that I use in making sure that the world that I'm building has longevity. Um, and probably the foremost of these is the idea that you cannot expect a world to last and you can't expect a world to endure if you are building that world around specifically the arc of one character. In other words, you know, you're building a world that used to be one way, that things were bad in some universal and profound way, and then this one person comes along and fixes it, and this is their story. Um, and I think that when you look at, let's say, franchises that have been built around chosen ones or otherwise characters who somehow righted the intrinsic wrong of the universe, those franchises have to work very hard to get out from under that story. And the truth is, we don't need one person to make everything okay as an audience. We don't need to think that someone else is going to come along and fix our problems for us. What we need, at least from film and television, is to see people do things that are impossible for them to do in spite of the impossibility. We need to see characters set out to achieve something they have no business trying to achieve and commit to it so completely that they end up rebuilding themselves into somebody who can actually accomplish that goal. And it doesn't matter if that goal is universally impossible in the sense that it's just so big that no person could do it, or if it's just impossible for this particular individual because of how they're built. So long as it's something we can see they're not going to succeed at, watching them go ahead and do all the work necessary to become someone who does, that's the magic of cinema, that transformation, and letting go of our identities in the process, because really heavy growth always involves, I don't want to say, like, from a literary standpoint, right, what we're talking about is catharsis, but That's not how it works in film and television. Characters change themselves. We don't submit them to circumstances that change them as much. So, you know, transformation on a fundamental level requires release and letting go. You can't hang on to who you were and still become who you're supposed to be. And if we see characters go ahead, hey, Steve, doing well. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Um, yeah, it's it's something that's occupied my attention, my imagination, and my labor since I was very very young, for sure. And actually, in a lot of ways, Jump Rangers is actually something that I picked up from the games that I used to play when I was very little. You know what I mean? I can imagine it's a big part of the fun of it's a big part of the fun of tabletop role playing. It absolutely is. And I myself am still kind of figuring out, and I think I've got it with Jump Rangers. I'm not so concerned that I'm getting it wrong. Oh, encounter design. Well, okay, maybe that's something we should talk about one of these weeks. Maybe that's something to put on that. Let me make a little note of that. Or maybe we talk about it today, since you're the only person here. But obviously, tabletop role playing has a lot to do with with um, with acting. There's a lot of similarities there. It's an acting game. It's an improv game. Okay, all right. Well, then let me put a note in here, and we'll come back and uh, and talk about it some other week. Hang on one sec. So, notes for the Rangers Roost. Okay. So we'll do building encounters. Yeah, why not? I think it's a great idea. All right. So the point that I'm making here is when you're building a world, you don't want to build that world around one person's efforts to accomplish a goal, because at some point you either need to accept that the world doesn't have any more problems because the thing has been achieved, or you have to diminish the achievement of the protagonist. You look at the development of Star Wars as a world building exercise, and eventually, like, you just have to acknowledge that Luke Skywalker didn't fix anything. The whole expansion of the Star Wars universe has been about looking for larger patterns in fascist behavior in order to give the characters that aren't Luke Skywalker more to do. And after a certain point, you you have to just accept that he never beat the Empire and he was never going to. And that kind of diminishes the impact of the original trilogy emotionally. You know, The Matrix has run into a very similar problem where the work of gaining control over the Matrix was the work of the first film for Neo. And the problem with the Matrix sequels is that although there's lots more themes to explore, he doesn't have anything to do. The second and third Matrix movies fundamentally are about Neo waiting for an opportunity to effect change. Well, here's what we're talking about is that when it comes to world building, you want to build a world that's bigger than your characters to begin with, I think. You don't want the hero of the story that you're telling to be the biggest thing in the world that you're building. You want the themes and ideas that you build your world around to be enduring enough and complex enough that the actions of the characters change those dynamics and swirl the stew around and have a meaningful effect, and the stories that you're telling become about more reasonable goals. like inspiring the people around you, creating movements of action, or or having an impact on someone else's life, or correcting an injustice, as opposed to, well, you know, I mean, for example, in the case of, Dungeons and Dragons, Ravensloft is basically about the undead reigning supreme over an entire planet, right? So what happens when the ultimate slayer shows up? I think the idea of Ravensloft is that you're never going to run out of undead to slay on this planet, but obviously the objective of that particular campaign setting is to do that. I think I think that when you are writing for tabletop role playing games and you're going into individual stories, I think, and world building obviously in Dungeons and Dragons is largely handled by the material itself. You know what I'm saying? Forgotten Realms is a very well developed and well understood piece of content. You've got other well developed, well understood worlds out there as well. And I think when it comes to the Dungeons and Dragons movie that they recently made, I think they made the right choices in terms of focusing on the efforts of a group of characters to accomplish a specific goal in that larger world, and to take that larger world for granted as part of that story. I think in general that's the right approach. When it comes to finding stories for campaigns, or finding stories for um, characters, I take a little bit of a different approach. I usually start in session zero by interviewing my players. And you can actually see that we talk about this stuff. If you watch the rookies. Yep. Yep. Well, there you go. Okay, so it's more about finding out, taking what interests you about the world that you've built, taking what interests you about the setting, and kind of developing that in as many different directions as you can, developing the ideas that you have in as many different directions as you can, and then looking at the systems and other things that would need to support those details, and then asking the players what interests them about that setting, so that they can kind of define their own goals, and they can choose what they want to achieve as characters in that setting, and then you can basically write the story in service to those goals and help them find opportunities to accomplish the goals that their characters are actually trying to achieve. So it's not so much about giving them a story; it's about pulling a story out of them. And that for me is more what game mastering is really about: is trying to find out what the players are into, what they're interested in, and then challenging them to go explore those things, or achieve those things, or get those things, or whatever it is that they want to do. And 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 that becomes an opportunity to explore the world that you've built, although it might not explore exactly the parts that you had planned on, and that's fine. Like, at the end of the day, what you do in terms of world building, obviously you're going to start building out the parts of the world that those characters are most likely to encounter. You have to, because you want to be prepared for where they're going. But whatever idea you had, whatever concepts you were sort of hooked up into, become a jumping off point. And I think the more media you're familiar with from a creative standpoint, I think the the more insight you're going to have into that process. For me, film has always been a touchstone, obviously, and part of why I think I'm good at world building is because I am a good filmmaker. And when you get right down to it, film is always about action. Film is about what the characters are doing to achieve overwhelmingly challenging goals, right? And every aspect of film comes down to that action, including the production design and including the backstory. Why does the Republic exist in Star Wars? Because people needed a system of government that was in some way inclusive to all these planets. They needed a way to resolve disputes that didn't involve war. They needed all these other things, and they built that system, right? When we look at the Death Star, it looks imposing, it looks dangerous, but it doesn't look imposing and dangerous because it's round. There's other round things. There's big round things. Things bigger than the Death Star are round and not as scary, right? Mars, bigger than the Death Star, not as scary. So it's not the shape language that makes it scary. What is it? Why is the Death Star threatening? Because the moment you look at it, you see the story behind it. It was built, obviously. You can see the seams in it. You can see the rivets in it if you look close enough. Right? Someone built this thing. What does that mean? Someone built a giant moon-sized planet-killing device. It must have evolved. And this is something that's been talked about in the Star Wars geekdom, right? How many people came together to build this thing? How many people are in the Death Star at any given moment? Lots. This is a monumental effort, and it involved a lot of people, which means either a lot of people think it's really important to blow up planets, or they were forced to do it. Right? There you go. Right? It's the fact that you can see the effort that went into creating it that makes it so threatening, because as soon as you see that, you realize what had to happen. And that tells you everything that you need to know about the Empire. The fact that they built this thing to blow up planets, and they must have conscripted probably whole planets worth of labor to do it. The fact that it must have taken years and and inevitably millions and billions of people to build this thing, and that it serves only one purpose. That story is communicated through the specificity of the design, through the construction-ness of it. That's why it's scary to look at. And, you know, I tend to look at any piece of world building in that way. X-Wings were obviously built in a garage to blow up TIE fighters. They look like that, right? TIE fighters look like they were built in a factory. To do what? Blow up cities, probably. Right? Scare people. They even sound threatening, but that threatening sound still sounds built. They sound like they were built to sound threatening. So when we do world building, for me at least, it's useful to consider the intent of the people to do things, and what tools would they need to do those things. What would they build in order to accomplish their goals? Those are the things the characters are going to find. You know, you look at the Saurian Horde, you look at the Loom in Jump Rangers, and you ask yourself, well, okay, what would I want? I want to explore certain themes. I want to explore imperialism. I want to explore privilege. I want to explore the idea that some people have more power and some people have less power. And, almost in a Buddhist sense, I think I wanted to explore the idea that sometimes we see the power if we're benefiting from a power relationship, we tend to view people who don't have that power as lesser, even to the extent where we don't think of them as people. And how many of those relationships exist in our lives? How many rats in our walls are there, and what's going on in those walls? Do maybe the beings that we leverage that power deserve more dignity and respect than we ascribe to them? Probably, if history is any indication, right? So that was a foundation for the world, and the reason why giant robots and giant dinosaurs are big is because that's power. We're small, they're big, and they have technology that we don't have, and they don't regard us as people. And that's that's kind of the most basic truth to the Jump Rangers universe, right? So why would they come here? To take what they need and without regard for us, right? That's why they would come here. So what tools would they build to come here? Yes. Yes, absolutely. Because if you understand what problems they're trying to solve, then you understand what tools they might leverage to solve those problems, and you can build those tools. And you know, it's important too, not just to consider what limitations the the sort of resources on a accounting level any given entity might have when sort of developing their plans, but also you want to understand the limitations and also the leeway afforded by the themes and the tone of the story that you're telling. You know what I mean? Like, for example, Jump Rangers has a sense of economy to it in the sense that people need to grow food and things are hard sometimes. But the economy of Jump Rangers is not as rigid as, let's say, the economy of Game of Thrones. It's not. You know what I mean? Because in Jump Rangers, we're playing a story about kids. We don't want the characters, the protagonists of this stories that we tell in Jump Rangers to be responsible for anything that kids wouldn't find fun. If you have a group that values and honors nature, would they actually use wood? True. True. Absolutely. You know, and and at the same time, you know, how how much do you want to, and this is a fair question, how much do you want to shake up, and how much do you want to shake up the mindfulness? Let's see, imagine there is probably a lot less sex, nudity, incest, and Jump Rangers than in Game of Thrones. Yes, of course. Of course. Right? But does that mean that people aren't having sex? No. Jump Rangers is about children. Someone had sex in Jump Rangers. It happened. Right? But it's not appropriate to expose the players to that. You know what I mean? That's not appropriate. And you know, depending on how you look at it, you could ask the same question about the elves in the wood. Are you promoting a higher level of mindfulness than people are necessarily comfortable with? If so, then that's an appropriate world building choice. But you don't want to, um, if you're going to shake up your audience in some way, you don't want to do it by accident. You want to be mindful in the ways in which you're pushing other people's boundaries because, you know, if you're pushing their boundaries as an entertainer, you are responsible for supporting them through that process. And you can't do that if you're not aware that their boundaries are being rattled in the first place. I see. Well, look, like it's not when it comes to Game of Thrones, the 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 not just the sex and the incest, but also the rape. All of these things are accepted parts of the world building. Like these are accepted political tools that the characters use to accomplish goals. These aren't just these aren't just things that happen. They're things that they're tools that people use. And that's true for any actor, for any situation. If something's coming up as a piece of world building in a story involving actors, whether it's film or television or whatever, you know, yes, That is why session zero is important. It is. It's also, um, but it's also something to be conscious of as somebody who is doing the world building to begin with, because you want to create um, an environment of storytelling that is safe in the ways that you want it to be safe and challenging in the ways that you want it to be challenging. So, it'll never be appropriate to have sexual politics. Not necessarily gender politics, but sexual politics in Jump Rangers. Well, I think it's in television, it's not so much about the values of the show. It's not so much about the themes that you're trying to push. It really is the themes come from the action of the story, ideally. So it really comes down to what are the characters trying to achieve? Where are they going to go in order to achieve those goals and given the resources that they have? If the characters don't have a spaceship, they're probably not going to another planet to accomplish their goals, right? Where are they going to go? How are they going to use the resources at their disposal to get there? If they need to steal something in order to get to where they're going, then where are they going to steal it from? And that becomes an environment where the show is taking place. So, in a lot of ways, when you're building a story in television, what you want to do is just make a list of the things that the characters need to accomplish in order to accomplish their goals. Like, are you leading a revolution? Okay, what does that mean? What do you have to do? You take over the seat of power, and murder everybody there. In the case of Game of Thrones, fine. That's what you have to do. So you have to get into this castle and kill everybody in there and take control of the city. What are you going to need to do to accomplish that goal? Let's see here. I think that there is a sliding scale when it comes to the quality of the writing on Game of Thrones. When Game of Thrones is at its most effective, I disagree with you. I think that a lot of the time characters are using sex to disempower one another. And I think that when they disempower, it's not just because they're horny, it's because the person that they're abusing has political power. I see. Well, it comes down to the efforts of the characters to accomplish their goals for the most part. You know what I mean? In the first few episodes of Game of Thrones, in the first season in general, the characters do have pretty strong through lines of action. Ned Stark is trying to solidify and unify the North in the face of all the politics that's going on down south. He wants the North to be safe and strong, and he's trying to build that, right? And he's trying to teach his kids to value that. Each of the kids has their own goal, and the Lannisters have their own goals, which are to take the North. And everybody's doing what they need to do to accomplish those goals. And all the people who are in King's Landing are trying to take power from the Lannisters or work their way into the good graces of the Lannisters. Well, you know what? Let's see. I don't know. I don't know. I think a scene isn't about conveying information. Fundamentally, it's not. A scene is about the efforts of the characters. Everything in acting is about action. It's not about communicating what's happening to the audience. It's about letting the audience watch the characters do what they're doing and make their own observations about it. Literature is about a writer making observations to the reader. Literature is about writing down all the things that happened in a story in such a way that they have meaning. We make observations about what a character is going through because they're exposed to certain themes, and those themes become the, the, the tie that binds those observations together. So this character's in this situation, and this happens, and then they feel this, and this happens, and this is going on with them, and all those observations become a narrative. And the way that we make that story compelling is by um, juxtaposing themes against each other. So, for example, in Game of Thrones, if as a book you have the theme of nobility, but also obviously the theme of abuse. Well, it is in literature. It is a different kind of information in literature. And in film and television, it's not. Okay? Because in film and television, what I'm trying to say here is that there is a huge difference between action and reaction. When a character is doing something, you can watch them do it. When a character is reacting to something that happened to them, even if that reaction involves a lot of running around, you're not really watching. You're waiting for the next thing to happen. And actions feel natural. When an actor is acting, you tend not to notice that they're acting. When a character is reacting, it feels like they're selling you something. And we judge their performance based on how well they sell that thing. And it's true, they are selling something. They're selling the thing that you're reacting to. So, you know, ideally, if an episode of a television story is about a specific character accomplishing one goal, then you write basically the three big things that they need to do in order to accomplish that goal, and those become the three acts of the television show. And then in Act One, you have this thing that they're trying to do. So let's say somebody's trying to marry their daughter to a prince. Have they met the prince? Where are they in their relationship with this? What are the three big things that they have to do? Well, the first thing they would probably have to do is get the prince's attention somehow. So that becomes Act One. Okay? What are all the things that they would need to do in order to achieve that goal? Each of those things becomes scenes. And then you just write the scenes where they do those things. Now, some of those things may take longer to do than others, but if the character is always doing something that's really challenging, then the effort of that character to accomplish that goal draws you in and makes you pay attention in a very real sense. Let's see what we got here. And I hear you. Yeah. Renji seemed to be there simply to be there. I think that does happen. I don't agree that it's a universal truth of those shows. I think on a good day, the characters are using sex as a tool to garner political power, which in and of itself is hard to watch and kind of vile, right? But that's the difference between an episode that's challenging to watch but compelling versus an episode that is gratuitous and obnoxious. And it might sound like a subtle distinction, but it's not, at least for me, and not in terms of the craft that went into it. It's a big distinction. And I think that a lot of HBO shows wind up with both. I think that by and large, um, Peacemaker, is that the name of the show? Was a very strong bit of television. They've got the executives at HBO definitely have put a emphasis on tone as the overriding value of their content, and the tone that they value is edgy and sometimes pulpy, and sometimes they hire filmmakers that know better and who say, okay, you want something edgy, but we can still do it well. And sometimes they hire filmmakers who don't. And the filmmakers who do embrace that tone as a guideline and then go and write actions that address that tone wind up doing shows like True Detective. And that's a magnificent show, you know, all the way through. So I haven't seen the latest season, but I intend to. And let's see. Well, I think that they're probably, but you can still, if that's what a producer wants. It's all right. It's all right. If that's what a producer wants. So let's talk about world building as a service, okay? Let's talk about that for a second, because you're not always building a world by yourself, and you're not always building a world under your own authority. Sometimes you need to go and work for somebody else and build the world that they want you to build. And when building that world, you have to tell stories in that world that address the strengths of the media that you're actually working with. If you're telling a story in in um, in film or television, then the story has to be built on what the characters are doing to achieve those goals, and those goals have to be overwhelmingly challenging, or they're not going to be interesting to watch. So you take that as a given. Now, if somebody wants there to be lots of sex and violence in the world that you're building, then there's two things you need to do. You need to write the story about actions and characters that require sex and violence. It would make a lot of sense. Like, if a story is about sex and violence, to tell the story of a, let's just say, a prostitute mass murderer who's looking to turn the tables on, you can tell that story very, very reasonably. If there's a prostitute who's looking to take power and control over that relationship, even to the extent where it becomes a story about getting away with murder, that's probably a show that would address the needs of the person that you're working for. If HBO wants sex and violence, then you tell the story of someone who has to have sex and violence to accomplish their goal. And you can also build worlds where the conditions are such that most people are forced to address sex and violence as a natural part of achieving their goals. And I think that that is where, for example, The Watchmen was coming from. There's enough sadists out there, there's enough this and that you can't afford to ignore sex and violence as tools to accomplish your goals. If you hope to accomplish anything, you can't. The way the world works is such that you can't, because other people are going to be using those tools for sure. And I think that that's where the writers of The Boys, for example, have really gotten longevity out of their content, is by creating a world where sex and violence are so accepted as tools of control that if you're not aware of how those tools get used, and if you're not willing to work in a world where those are commonplace tools, whether or not you choose to abuse other people's sex and violence is relevant, but you need to be prepared for the fact that someone's going to. Or you're going to learn real hard that this is not a safe place. I think that they've managed to accomplish that. I understand it. I understand it. But I just want to make a distinction between, you know, this isn't good writing and this isn't um, safe or interesting for me personally. Because I agree. I think that there are a lot of episodes and writing out there where that stuff just gets leveraged. I think it's good. I enjoyed Gen V as well quite a bit, you know. And something else I will say on the subject of world building using kind of gritty tones is that I think I'm out of patience for edgelord rude boys as writers. I think that whether or not I think a piece of content is particularly good in terms of how it's built, we've seen Joss Whedon get taken down for his abusiveness on set. We've seen Warren Ellis and all the allegations of grooming against him come to fruition. You know, the minute somebody starts espousing themselves as a Bukowski fan, at this point, my alert lights, all the alarms go off. You know what I mean? And I don't know whether it's possible to have a fetishistic interest as a content creator in rape, Nazi lore, aggressive violence, all the rest of it, without, um, I, on some level, having issues with power, deep issues with power. And if you have deep issues with power as a man, yeah, yep, yep. And I mean, Zack Snyder seems to have really loyal people around him. And I will say it's also good policy to judge people by the company they keep. I think that if someone's friends tend to have a lot of integrity and ethical fortitude, then I think that it's reasonable to look for that, throughout that community, typically. But I am also very much in the where there's smoke, there's fire camp when it comes to people who are uh, fetishistically fascinated with abusive content. I'll tell you what, Steve, it's probably a good time for me to log off. Go get your banana. Thank you very much for being here. Um, this is a good place to sign off. Thank you to anybody who's watching Rangers Roost. It's definitely an interesting conversation. We have we have the rookies today at 2:30 Pacific time. If anybody wants to see some Jump Rangers actual play, please come and say hi. I think it's going to be a fun game. I think there's going to be the shenanigans. I think are what we're looking at. This I think this is going to be a day where we don't see the plot move ahead too much. We'll see. I have plans and I'm ready to move forward with them, but I'm not going to step on the characters to make that happen. You too, Steve. Thank you. If anybody else is catching this, come see the rookies and don't be a stranger, Ranger.